Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode. This episode is very important. Especially we do discuss on satellite to improve lives, and this is really helpful. Trust me. I just finished a classes with the 20 startup. I actually help them to grow their data analysis and data science and other things. They are very big fan of data, AI, satellite. So I think developing nations has big futures. So I want to start from Professor Edward. You are very expert. I'm also a big fan of uh, your think tank, and it's very informative, excellent. Even I share with my students, Mr. James Eid, even Manuel Initiative, Mr. Aaron Initiatives, Mr. Edwards, and everybody actually like World Talent Economy Forums in Malaysia. They are observing our show and they really like your excellent analysis. I'm really impressed. All of your analysis actually impressed by the youth communities in Malaysia. That is the beauty of World Talent Economy Forum. Professor Edward, want your brilliant analysis for today's topic.
Well, I shall try to live up to that incredible introduction. I'm not sure if I can, but when I was a youth, and I'm not a youth anymore, I'm afraid, space and satellites were the cutting edge of technology, and they still are in many ways. Satellites have been serving humans for some 60 years now. In fact, we're coming up next year on the 60th anniversary of the launching of Telstar, which was the first communication satellite that allowed, for example, television shows to be beamed from the United States live to Europe, that allowed phone calls to be beamed live around the world, as well as other sorts of information. That was 1962 that Telstar was launched. And since then, of course, we have the world in low Earth orbit is covered with satellites. Think of satellites in several ways. First of all, there are orbiting tools, just like we have tools here on Earth to do things, to manufacture things, and the like, to measure things and whatever. So we have them in orbit. And you can think of satellites as orbiting infrastructure. In other words, they're not just things that perform certain dedicated tasks, but they really are infrastructure, that meaning that they can be used not just for one function, but for many functions. Of course, the fact that we're having this discussion right now is in part because we have satellite communications. And satellites, of course, you perform many functions. Obviously, communications was the first use of satellites with Telstar and other satellites. But satellites, of course, are monitors. Satellites can and do, in fact, look at the Earth, and they look at crops. They look at they measure weather. They measure climate. They measure every kind of imaginable thing. There was a discovery that I wish I had the graphic for you, and maybe I can find it for a future show. Back in the early 1990s, when I was doing work on international economic development, I found a satellite photo of a place in the Sahel Desert in Africa, and it was a you could see the desert area, and then you could see a big kind of pentagonish shape area that looked different, darker color. And you thought, what is it? It's like something 10 or 20 miles across. And you thought, is this an alien that's come down and done some weird thing to the land? And what it turned out was that in that particular part of the desert, the government had set up property rights so that that basically people, indigenous populations, could graze their animals, could plant, and make sure that someone else wouldn't get wouldn't get whatever they planted, and so forth. And so you had this one area in the desert that was green and large because, and when you looked into it, you found out that was why it was, because in fact they had the rights to graze their animals and do things there, and others couldn't come in and steal the stuff and take it and so forth. So it was an interesting discovery that I would not have known about when I was dealing with international economic development if I hadn't had a satellite image to say. So I could go to people, I could go to the development community and say, look at this. If you do this, look, the Earth is green because of this particular policy. But again, thank you for the satellites to do that. Of course, when we talk about satellites as infrastructure, well, let me make one other point about satellites. There's been plans over several decades to put orbiting solar collectors in, so that they could basically take sunlight, convert it into electricity, and beam it down to Earth in the form of microwaves or in some other form of energy to provide cheap energy, cheap, clean energy. Now, the problem has been that launch costs are still too high to do that. It doesn't make any economic sense if you have to pay $100,000 a pound to put, a half a ton of materials in orbit. But we're getting to that. We'll hopefully get to that point thanks to Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and folks like that. When I talk about infrastructure, I mean this. Think of the development in the Western world, especially Britain, of infrastructure for manufacturing. At first, if you had a factory or a plant, you had to have your own energy source there. In other words, you had to have some sort of a steam engine, and you had to burn coal or whatever it is in the steam engine. What happened, of course, is we developed in the late 1800s in the United States and elsewhere electric grids, so that if I wanted to start a business, whatever size, I could simply plug into the electric grid, and some big facility was producing the electricity. And so it made it easier for me. I didn't have to figure out how to provide my own power. There have been plans by a number of entrepreneurs to do exactly that in orbit. In other words, to set up essentially energy hubs, so that if an entrepreneur wants to put something up there to, for example, do research or to do experiments in weightlessness or whatever, they could simply plug into the energy source. Now, unfortunately, because the costs are still very, very high, there have been a lot of failures or ideas that haven't come to fruition. For example, a gentleman named Robert Bigelow has put almost $500 million into creating private space stations. And they're actually on the International Space Station. One of his modules is up there on the space station as an experimental module. I visited his facility out near Las Vegas, and it's really fascinating. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, the economy didn't work very well. He had to lay off all his people. I'm not sure if he's coming back. The point is this: satellites have been serving us for 60 years in many, many, many ways. And just as entrepreneurs on this planet figure out ways to do interesting things, to create interesting tools, to create interesting infrastructure, I think we're going to see even more of that in orbit, with satellites, with infrastructure, and with every kind of orbiting platform for every kind of interesting function.
Thank you. My friend, Mr. Jamesid, how are you today? How do you want to analyze today's topic? And he has a lot of energy. Yesterday, he did excellent work with me. And yes, Mr. Jamesid.
Thank you, Sharif. It's always a pleasure to be on these shows, and I always learn something, unless it's just me talking. And I do think all this optimism about satellites is very well deserved. But I also have a skeptic cap on, and I think about what are the downsides of this, and should we pay attention to this? Because the extraordinary possibilities are amazing. The ability to interconnect, because I think when you have all these people connected, then you start to think about the planet rather than just yourself, and you never feel alone when you're in a community and you're connected to a community. So these are all very positive developments. But one of the things that is happening is the clutter of our night sky. And so this was kind of like a given right for people to look up at the stars in the sky. And now we see shiny satellites, and sometimes observers they train their telescopes on specific areas of the sky, and in order to track it over a long period of time to see very far into the past. And now they can have their vision blurred by a satellite. Now, this is the things we can get into. Okay, are you doing harm? Can you go to a court of law and prove that you're doing harm? And can you sue? And, this is kind of unanticipated consequences of just the freedom that we all want. We want to be able to be free to do what we want, but do I have the freedom to block your night vision? Can I put up a tarp from my house that blocks your field of vision from your house? And so these are kind of thorny questions to decide, and we haven't even scratched the surface of what is it that we're doing if we're cluttering the sky, the night sky, so that I can no longer look up at the stars. I don't know if it's a star I'm seeing. And these are sometimes philosophical, sometimes legal, and sometimes economic questions. Because do the economic benefits outweigh the costs? Well, my feeling is yeah, but let's not forget the economic costs. We used to think rivers were abundant, and you could pour your toxic waste into rivers because there was endless river water. And we found out that wasn't true, that we poisoned things, flora and fauna downstream. And then we slapped an environmental cost on the people that were producing this waste. And so, is there an environmental cost to proliferation of satellites in our night sky? Maybe, maybe not, but are we even talking about that? And the other thing is Edward talked about this wonderful application. You can see this field of vision from the night sky, and you could see this little patch in the Sahara Desert. And you get really kind of excited about those things. But then there's the question of privacy. Can you see me in my backyard? And is that available to the internet now? I'm sunning myself in my backyard, and all of a sudden it's on the internet. And so maybe there's questions of privacy, maybe there aren't, but are we even talking about them? And then the question of access. Does everyone have equal access to this? Or do you have to pay Elon Musk something to get the benefit of what Elon Musk is doing? And if I have to pay, then by necessity, there are those that can pay and those that cannot pay. And so we have created another wall in our society and a division between us. So when we can sit back and think, oh, we're all connected. No, we're not all connected. Some of us are connected and some of us are not. So this question of access becomes interesting. And I don't have all the answers, but I'm just starting to ask the questions. Is there a downside to this proliferation of satellites? Maybe, maybe not, or maybe the boons outweigh the downside. So, there's a cost-benefit analysis that I don't think is being done, or if it's done, it hasn't come across my desk. And so I think that these questions have to be answered, as well as having complete joy in the experience to be doing something that was never, ever possible until now. These things are marvelous. And I don't want to cloud your enthusiasm over this, but I do want you to pay attention to both sides of the coin. Thanks, Sharif.
Thank you. We have our satellite expert, Manuel. So how do you want to analyze today's topic, and what are the new thought you want to share with our audience?
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here today. So yeah, I think the Professor Edward and Mr. James, as they mentioned it earlier, we can use satellites for communication. It can be used for TV broadcast, and it can be used for internet access, and also for telecommunication. And also we can use it for Earth observation, for remote sensing, and for navigational. We have navigational satellites which are helping us to use our GPS. And we have weather satellites for climate and weather monitoring. We have also reconnaissance satellites, which are used for intelligence and by military. We have we can also use satellites for business and finance, for example, for mobile banking to secure mobile banking. Yes, and satellites can also be used for science and research. For example, we have other kind of spacecraft like telescopes and other uh, scientific satellites that are used for research purpose. So for the applications, we can use satellites for different applications, different geospatial applications. Today, we see most of the developed countries and developing countries, they are discussing about digital transformation, creating smart cities, and for example, distributed manufacturing, Internet of Things. So yeah, at the center of all this, we have satellites, which can help in the different sectors. We also have we can also use satellites to empower sustainable development. For example, if we are using satellites to bring a stable internet access, that will help e-commerce startups to develop, and that can also support the economy of the specific country. So, like Mr. James mentioned it's not only the positive sides or the positive impact that we can see from the satellites, we also have the negative impacts. For example, one of those negative impacts today is the space debris. So there are a lot of debris that are a big danger to humanity. So during the last G7 summit, the world leaders they talked about this. They discussed about this, how to bring in space sustainability and space safety, and also during the European Union Green Deal few days ago, they also mentioned the importance of Earth observation, and they brought in Earth observation of experts to discuss how we can use satellites to support uh, the the Green Deal and to to support climate to fight climate change and other climate issues that we are facing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We have our friend Mr. Aaron's, even Mr. Aaron actually helping to our core team. Thank you for your brilliant support for World Talent Economy Forum. And how do you want to analyze today's topic? And we want more people like you in our team. And yes, Professor Edwards and Mr. James, they will be our scholars and even manuals, but we need to grow our company and grow our organizations. So what your analysis on satellite?
Well, thank you for the introduction, Sharif. Let's start by, I guess, defining satellites. A satellite is anything that orbits the Earth regularly. Relatively speaking, that's the most basic cut and dry definition. So the International Space Station is a satellite. The Hubble telescope and the new generation space telescopes, I can't recall their names at the moment. But those are also examples of satellites, and those have already led to some cutting edge breakthroughs in interplanetary sciences. And even in the emergent field of what some are starting to call astrobiology and, the hunt for, possible atmosphere bearing planets that might be able to bear life. And even just the discovery of planets themselves being able to be noted by minute wobble differences detected by, space telescopes. You got to figure just 20, 30 years ago, we didn't even believe that there were other planets on such a scale outside of our solar system. And now we know that it's practically, you might as well say infinite. By any manners of human recognition, it might as well be infinite. So satellites, it being anything that orbits the Earth, this is where we start getting into future superstructures and human colonies, in space and things like that. Those are examples of far-flung examples of satellites. You have Starlink, which is already making some great changes. It's expensive, but the startup costs of these things are also expensive, astronomically. So, you know, cut the guy a little bit of slack, you know. But as James said, and this is why I always love having Professor Edward and James Eid on the same show, because they so eloquently pose both sides of this coin, and both sides have such incredible valid points. So I love having you guys on the same show every time. It's just a smash hit. You know, on top of all the economic impacts that Edward was talking about, on top of all the applications that Manuel was talking about, I do think it's important that we start to look at, you know, there's a lot of space junk starting to accumulate now. I would like to see entrepreneurs leverage that to an advantage somehow, because by right of maritime salvage law, you should just be able to go up there and snatch those things and, you know, do pretty much whatever you want with them, because of the right of maritime salvage law. As space is technically considered international waters, it's ruled by maritime law. To the best of my understanding, that information may, however, be outdated. But essentially, you know, and this puts images in people's minds of, you know, space pirates commandeering satellites, and this is a potential future. It truly is. So you know, I think that it's important that we do, you know, examine Mr. Eads' point, but at the same time, Edward's completely right. You can't stop this march of progress. It is an incredible leap for the sake of preserving human knowledge and the sake of, you know, advancing us towards the future and of tying us all together. You know, this is the main network that's going to do that. And as we become an interplanetary species, these satellite systems that we're developing here on Earth are eventually going to interlink, and that's going to become so critical to you and I being able to sit here in, say, 100 years and have the same conversation, but I'm on Mars. And we're not in alignment. It's the wrong time of year for us to talk, and yet we're still able to induce signal. So these are the far-flung advantages of that. Again, I apologize for the rant, but that's just my basic analysis of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Edward, I want more futuristic thought like what Mr. Aaron actually shared from you, and even for our other speakers. Actually, I'm really happy today how I see that Malaysian youth community, how they respect World Talent Economy Forum speakers, and how they are actually changing their thought. And hopefully, if we are overcome from this COVID situation, we will make a very interesting gathering. And yesterday, I also share, Mr. James did also see that around 10,000 organizations from Asia Pacific, their connections, they are joining with World Talent Economy Forum with these futuristic thoughts and other things. So hopefully it will be a very interesting journey for everyone. And we want more of your energy and analysis, but we need more futuristic thought on satellites and improve how it improves lives.
Okay, well, I'll start off with some practical stuff, and then I love what Aaron is doing, of course, because I'm a futurist. In case you haven't guessed from the materials on my wall here, I originally majored in physics and astronomy. So, and as you know from other shows, when I was a little high school intern, I worked at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center during Apollo 11 moon landing. And I later got Buzz Aldrin to do a chapter in my space book here. So this has been an interest from literally when I was a little kid. So anyway, but I'll start with a few practical things, and then I'll move out to exactly the sort of thing Aaron was talking about. You know, again, originally as an astronomy major, I appreciate the issues of a lot of stuff up there in the sky that can distract from astronomy. I mentioned in a previous show that my brother was about a week or two ago was on a camping trip with his grandchildren, and they're at night and they look up in the sky and they see these little dots of light going across, and they quickly said, "What are those things?" You know, they didn't think they were aliens, but they got on their phones real quick. They went online and they discovered that they were Elon Musk's Starlink satellites going overhead. I'll mention something about that in just a moment. There is a serious problem of space junk, and I want to frame it for your listeners in sort of a broader terms. You don't just say, "Oh, this suddenly appeared up there. There are bad people who put it up there." There's a thing in economic analysis called the tragedy of the commons. That is to say, when something is not owned or you do not have some kind of secure rights in materials or other assets, then there is a incentive for everybody to use as much as possible and to deplete the asset very, very quickly. So, for example, if you have a river and nobody owns the river, then I can dump my waste into the river. You can dump your waste into the river. Hey, there's no penalty. There's no cost. I just do that. And that's how rivers became polluted. And so what happened is either you had governments come in and say you can't do that, or you had property rights established in rivers. For example, if you take a look at Scotland and some places in England, going back, not just recently, but you go back a century or two, you find property rights established in rivers. So if a river goes through my land, I cannot dump waste into that river if it's going to go down on James's land. And so James is protected because James has property rights, or a certain kind of right. He can use the water, he can access the water, but the person upstream cannot put something in the water that's going to kill all his fish and things like that. And you have the same thing. I can give you a whole lecture. There's a whole literature on the so-called tragedy of the commons. And I think what you're going to see in the future is discussions of how to establish some kind of property rights, as it were, in orbit. So do I have a property right in, if I have a telescope, if I'm at the Palomar Observatory, the Keck Observatory, to look up there and not have something, a satellite go through my field of vision when I'm doing a 10-hour exposure, something like that? I think the answer, incidentally, is going to be technology. First of all, if you have a good system tracking the space junk, and then I'm sitting there in my observatory, and of course I've programmed it into the computer, and so I know that exactly this 2-second interval, there's going to be a satellite going through the field of vision where my camera is pointed. So I basically just turn the camera off, and they're basically LCD camera. They're basically computer cameras anyway. I turn it off and then turn it back on. So there's going to probably be things like that. The other thing is you're going to see emergence more of, which you've already seen, of astronomy in orbit. And Aaron mentioned the Hubble Space Telescope. I've got Hubble pictures on my wall here. You have a ultraviolet telescope up there already. You have an X-ray telescope in orbit already. You have a gamma ray telescope in orbit already. And one of the things, as a little intern when I was sitting at NASA Goddard and I couldn't do anything else, I would play around with how you would put an observatory on the far side of the moon. So you want to talk about something that really has a great view and is not being interfered by Earth light. That would be one of the things. So I think you're going to see those things emerge in the future. But I want to make two more, I think, important points. First of all, I'm not particularly worried about the haves and the have-nots in this sense. We always hear, we don't want a society in which you have just an elite that have a lock, as it were, on technology or on anything else. We want mobility. And what you saw, for example, in the 1980s and 90s is fear of what's called a digital divide. That is, that we're going to have some people who have access to all the world's information through some form of personal computer. That's going to be a small group. And then the masses are going to be ignorant because they can't access the technology. Of course, what happens is Moore's law meant that the cost of technology went down and down and down. And so, for example, smartphones were introduced by Steve Jobs in 2007. 80-some% of American adults now have smartphones. And so as technology develops, the costs go down. And so, yeah, how many Americans have access not only to personal computers, just about everyone, smartphones, just about everyone. All of these technologies, the costs go way down over time. And that's what we hope will happen with any kind of good or service provided by satellites. I want to mention one other thing, and this is important for your community and thinking about what you do with the technology. In the United States right now, there are three fundamental ways of getting online and doing what we are doing right now at this very moment. There's fiber optics, which is some sort of a wire, or in this case, fiber going into your house, so you can get television, internet, and so forth. And there are 5G towers, 4G towers, and now 5G towers are spreading in the United States, so you can do it that way. And of course, there are satellites. Now, unfortunately, our government is looking at putting $100 billion into fiber optics to, so they say we want 100% of the population of the United States covered, with 100 gigs of access to, online, to high-speed internet. But the thing is, favoring one technology over another is not a good idea, because government planners don't do that very well. The market does it very well. And I think it intuitively makes more sense that if you're in a rural area, probably using Elon Musk's satellites is going to be far, far cheaper and less expensive than having wires run out to your house, which is very expensive to do, fiber optic cable. So I always caution people that let the market work, and maybe 5G towers probably work very well for where I'm at in my part of the country. Satellites work better for others. Fiber works better for others. I want to add one more thing in terms of futuristic thinking. We are literally today, sort of imagine the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and look at how far we've come in 200 years. That's where we are today with future technology. We are talking realistically now, not science fiction, about going to Mars, settling Mars, putting colonies on Mars, or settlements on Mars, I should say. That's no longer science fiction. It's an actual ongoing thing. And Elon Musk, of course, is leading the way on that one. We have other really futuristic things to think about. Again, orbiting hotels, something that Robert Bigelow was thinking about. If you really want to get futuristic, everyone read about what a Dyson sphere is. This is really futuristic. Freeman Dyson, I have one of his books back here that I met him. Freeman Dyson came up with this idea, and you can read it in science fiction, of you have a star and then you build a whole sphere around the star. And so the sunlight, 100% of the sunlight is captured because the star is inside of a big sphere that you've made out of, the debris from planets and so forth. You want to talk, if you really want to get inspired, look at some of the good science fiction, because people like me read that stuff when we were kids. And that's what kind of inspired us to do our thing. And I'm sure Aaron, and I'm sure James and Manuel, and maybe even Sharif have done the same thing. So, So, if you're out there in Malaysia, know that here in the United States, a lot of this came because we watched Star Trek, we watched Forbidden Planet, we watched 2001: A Space Odyssey. We got really inspired about what is possible. And we realized that it takes little steps. You can't just snap your fingers and do it at once. But you've got to think big and then start looking at the ways you can get there in one step and another. So sorry for going on, but this is a very exciting topic indeed.
Excellent. Mr. Jamsid, can we play chess in the satellite, or if we go to the?
We already have.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, excellent.
Yeah.
So you share your experience with our audience.
Oh well, there are astronauts that have played chess on with people on Earth. So that's for the chess community, that was pretty cool. I don't want to dampen anyone's enthusiasm, because these are just fascinating topics. And I won't say addicted to, but I was quite often found reading science fiction when I was a child. And also the tragedy of the commons, because these are things that that we're talking about, a complex subject. And I'll give you one example of how we can misuse our brains trying to solve a problem. When there was a time when there was a rat problem on an island, and so they wanted, and rats forage at night, and so they wanted to bring in a predator to eliminate the rats. Only they brought in a predator that foraged by day. And so what they did is they kept the rats, and the predator they brought in ate the birds. So we don't want to make mistakes like that. So we have to use our intelligence when we're doing this. And I'm not including Edward in this, because I think Edward is more balanced in this, but I do encounter this technology belief, this technology almost religious fervor. And we don't want to start asking ourselves, what would Elon Musk do? This is what I want to damp down the enthusiasm while still experiencing the joy of possibility. And I think both are possible. And I do want to think about the future, but I say to myself every morning, surrender to the moment to be fully present, because we have to live in the present. And the past is one thing, the future is another thing, but be in the present when you're thinking about them, and use your mind and to think about the social impact, because we want a socially just society. There's absolutely no question. But history tells us that the elite will take more than their fair share. And there will be people just hoping for the crumbs that will fall to them, and not enough crumbs to survive on. So this is what history teaches us. So the past forms us, but it can also inform us if we allow it to. So don't make the mistakes of the past. Don't bring in a daytime predator for a nighttime problem. So these are one of the other consequences that I forgot to mention, is that you have to connect the satellites to the physical internet backbone. And how do you do that? Well, you do that by making connections to physical entities on the planet Earth. And so when you make that connection, how are you connecting? Is there a possibility of radiation? Is there a possibility of electromagnetic fields that are created? And is that good for life? So are we going to connect to a spot that no people can live in? These are another consequences that's unanticipated. And yeah, these people are doing things for whatever. They're not bad people. We're not talking about good and bad here. We're talking about unintended consequences. And if there are unintended negative consequences, what are we going to do about that? And if we want to say, okay, it's think of space as waters, and so we'll apply maritime laws, well, that may or may not be appropriate. And how are we going to agree on the laws we abide by? We tend to be, as a species, not very good at that. Not very good at collaboration and cooperation, about sharing the resources that are available to us. So these are things that I don't want to, don't want to damp down the enthusiasm, because this is beyond my power to explain how joyful I feel sometimes about the possibilities that are opening up for the first time in our blink of an eye existence on this planet. But we have to balance our rights versus our needs, because right now when we talk about owning a piece of a river, to the indigenous population of the United States, that would seem laughable. But okay, so we do that now. But now we have municipal rights that all of them have to come into alignment to allow a bullet train from Northern California to Southern California. Now, does the bullet train make absolute sense in California? Absolutely. Sure. You would be able to travel
None at
so
all.
much more easily. So much more easily. I don't interrupt you, Edward, so please don't interrupt me. And I think that these things you have to agree and get every municipality to buy into it. And that's very unlikely to happen. So some of these possibilities that exist for, that we can imagine and technologically we can do, we cannot get people aligned to agree to do them. And whether or not you think it's a good idea or a bad idea, it doesn't matter. I'm just pointing out the example of the lack of cooperation. And we have to get aligned on what we want to achieve. And I think it's a fallacy to believe that technology unchecked will solve all their problems. It's magical thinking, in the same way that it's magical thinking. Don't ask yourself, what would Elon Musk do? It's not a productive question, and it doesn't answer the problems. The Dyson sphere I hadn't heard of. That's fascinating. But there is an educational divide in our country. We found this out almost to our horror during the pandemic. Is that okay? We can't meet in schools, so let's meet through Zoom and have Zoom education. And then we found out, holy cow, a whole lot of kids don't have computers. Oh, I never thought of that. And so they couldn't learn the way the people that had computers could learn. So yeah, let's not pretend that this is going to be an egalitarian society. It's very unlikely that it will. So I just think that we want to be measured We want to be balanced in our approach and not believe in fairy tales, not believe in futuristic magical thinking. That technology cannot be unchecked. Technology, the application of technology must be for the interest of all, not just a few, or we will create the disasters we've seen in the past on a wide scale that may not be recoverable. So these are the things, not just space junk. That's what we're seeing now. Well, imagine the future in a different way, where space control. And so the totalitarian control over space, because that's another possibility. We don't like to think about it. But these things have to be thought about, and they have to be balanced, and they have to be for the good of all. Otherwise, it will not work in the long run, and we'll repeat the mistakes we've made in the past. Thanks again, Sharif, for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Manuel.
Sure. Thank you. I think it's a great discussion going on right now, and I like it a lot. So, yeah, first of all, I wanted to comment on the sci-fi part, and then I can add a few more points. So, speaking of sci-fi, I would like to say that it's really, really important because I remember I was watching a sci-fi movie and they were talking about quantum communication satellites, and of course the name they called it the system was like really sci-fi, but when the engineer in the sci-fi movie was trying to explain, I was able to understand what he was saying. And I remember after that, the following days, I went to the library and I took a book on neural computing, quantum computing, and optical computing. And few days later, I was able to come up with a specific configuration that we used later in one of our inventions. But to patent the invention, we didn't add the name quantum because it will sound it will sound like really sci-fi, but the configuration was like quite the same as what they used in the sci-fi movie. So just to say that yeah, sci-fi can inspire, but it's also how to implement it that we should know, yeah, how to do. And I wanted also to come back to the technology transition point that was mentioned before, because one of the problem to implement satellites technologies in developing countries is that governments, they already decided to go for fiber optics, and they already voted a budget for that, and the big companies, they are already into that. So it's like coming up and saying that no satellites telecommunication will be cheaper and everything is just dangerous for whoever is saying that. So what we are doing now is that we we are, for example, at STAC, we are trying to reach out to big telecommunication companies, for example, in Africa and in Europe, so that if those big telecommunication companies can decide to go for satellite telecommunication, then they can implement it in their different branches in different countries, so that we can at least have some option over there. So yeah, that's one way we are doing it. And uh, talking about a futuristic way, I would say one of the challenges that is going to come when we are talking about the future, it's the policy and the regulations. Because if a private company is going to colonize Mars, then who is going to own the 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 like the resources that they are going to get from the moon or from Mars? Who is going to own that? Is, for example, if US is the first country to reach Mars, is it going to belong to be for the US only? So that are the questions that the policymakers and the space policy and law experts are discussing right now, and also to look into the space sustainability, so that the colonization of the moon or the use of satellite technologies will not harm the human rights, but we should also look into the ethics and the social responsibility. And also, yeah, I also had the chance to work with Express Foundation. They work closely with SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and other bigger private space companies. So one of the points that we are looking into right now is space tourism and women health in space. So all those we need to look into the different aspects, especially when it comes to the policy and the regulations, because it's in space, but we need to set some boundaries so that everyone cannot do everything they want with space. So that to make sure that space can be useful for everyone on Earth and to ensure the sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Aaron.
Wow, what a great discussion today. Seriously, and honestly, seeing Edward and James again, if we could just get you guys on some sort of centralized open source debate forum, just y'all's discourse could probably solve 90% of the world's problems between the two of you. Honestly, two very brilliant
Yes.
speakers with two
We-
very valid worldviews.
Yin and yang.
Yeah, we have World Talent Economy Forum. We have our debate academy, Asia Debate Academy. We are running from year 2013. Even though I'm also planning that we will arrange some debate, Professor Edward, James Ed, yeah, different the youth community also can be their teammate, and hopefully it will be very interesting.
I certainly can't wait to see it. I'll say that. I would be willing to pay to see that.
Okay.
Seriously, I would. Now, and secondly, Edward, did I hear you correctly? Did you say you actually met Dyson?
Oh yeah, I met Friedman Dyson. He was at NASA Goddard had and still has a speaker program, and so I was there for one of his speeches. I have a signed book by him. I've read a number of his books. He passed away a year or so ago, but incredible individual.
Yeah, I would have probably had a stroke if I were to just randomly bump into Mr. Dyson. I'm sorry, I'm not too familiar with first names, but I'm very familiar with his work in the Dyson sphere. Honestly, though, from what I'm seeing, by the time we can actually build a Dyson sphere, it's probably going to be obsolete from some of the advances we've been making in exotic matters and exotic manners of physics. Don't get me wrong, we still haven't found dark matter yet, but that's a whole separate subject, whole separate series of discussions. Moving on from here, I like what you said about air traffic, looking at it kind of like air traffic to some degree, as opposed to a certain type of ownership over the night sky. I think it would be a lot easier to implement a sort of an air traffic model. How do you own, and this is another question in terms of how do you own infinity? Space is quite literally infinite. All of our legislation has been tailored to this finite, tiny little ball, and it doesn't even work very well here right now. So what makes us think that we can, in our sanest minds even, write legislation to govern the infinite cosmos? However, we are at a point where we're kind of having to. We're having to take this giant leap, and new legislation is being discussed for decades because it's so theoretical at this point. So, as much as we're clawing around for answers here, I don't think we're going to see any answers to this anytime soon. And that's one of the disturbing things about Mars colonization, like Manuel brought up, and that was kind of touched upon, is, what if it's called Mars for a reason? That's the name of the Greek god of war, or was it Roman? I can't quite recall which anymore. But that's the literal god of war. And we're talking about a planet named after it. I wouldn't be surprised to see a self-fulfilling prophecy sort of scenario ensue if human nature up to this point is anything to be based off of moving forward into the future. The way that Antarctica is currently governed is how people think that we'll be able to govern space. But again, Antarctica is a very small, relatively useless chunk of land compared to, again, the vast infinity of the cosmos. And when you start factoring in, space mining operations and things like that, which have been suggested as methods for getting raw materials for building large-scale space stations, because it doesn't make much sense to mine the materials in space and then bring them down to Earth. That's not very efficient. Your best bet is implementing them on construction facilities, in space. It's actually, once you're in space, everything's way easier. There's no gravity to account for. So then you end up with incredible scenarios using satellites, like Mars has a very weak magnetosphere, if any at all. In fact, it's been speculated by NASA scientists that if we could remedy that problem within 100 years, Mars would be fairly well habitable, just by resolving that one tiny issue because of how it affects gas separation in the upper atmosphere levels and water separation and evaporation. So again, you end up with this massive network concept of satellites around a planet absorbing solar radiation and deflecting it in this electromagnetic shield around the entire planet is one of the applications. You end up also with concepts that I've heard of not just collecting solar energy from Earth's upper atmosphere and from the orbit of Earth, but also literally targeting the trajectory to the heart of the ionosphere and the magnetosphere, and siphoning that ionic energy directly and beaming that down. Now, again, I'm not an expert on this matter. I'm not building these systems. It's simply something that I came across in theoretical discussions about the future of this particular topic. But again, when it comes to how do you legislate infinity, I think it's kind of been touched upon briefly in your show, the concept of philosophical Taoism and of Wu Wei, which is basically just a philosophical principle of the more you try to interfere with something, the worse you make it. Human beings are inherently flawed, and there are certain balancing aspects to the fundamental natures of the universe. For every action, there's always opposed and equal reaction. So having this sort of understanding as we move forward is going to be critical, as we're forced to blindly create legislation that's going to have effects that we will not understand, probably won't even live to see the fullest extents of. It's going to take really kind of stepping back and focusing on the greater needs here as we move forward. Yes, you can make an incredible profit in this industry. Should that not be enough to where you can then, start offering, more humanitarian space travel endeavors? And I know Elon briefly, he kind of had this idea, which ended up being basically construed as indentured servitude. I'm not going to pick one side or the other on that. I think it's a very gray area, and again, this is one of those areas where legislation's really gray. The ethics, the philosophies of it is really subjective at this point. We have no real studies to go off of, no real field examples. So that's kind of one of the more disturbing aspects of it, is that we are essentially just going all out into the wild blue yonder like children in the dark. And all we're armed with is a tiny little flashlight, our little bitty 2 feet to carry us through this infinite black abyss of who only knows what in all of this infinity. And that's why it's important that we analyze science fiction, especially dystopian science fiction novels, because that's going to give us the projection of the worst fears of these things and allow us to back engineer that to kind of realize how we can get around some of these aspects. Now, again, this isn't talking about Skynet and horrible misunderstandings of how AI operates. I guess I'll go ahead and stop there. I'm monologuing. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. It's a really, really great session and great learning session for the youth community, policymakers, corporations, academia. So I directly want to go for the concluding remarks. Before that, I request everyone, next week we have our summit conference on future of healthcare system, because this is the burning issues. From Monday to Friday, we have our conference. We will send you the invitations. So if our speakers want to present their research papers or on about their organization, they will get 12 minutes of slot. And most importantly, we want to start our sessions from 10:15. Just we want to give some preparation time and everything to our speakers and everything, and hopefully it will be very, very effective. And after that, definitely beside this kind of roundtable discussions, we will arrange debating, because World Talent Economy Forum, they have Asian Debate Academy. Even though in 2013, I was team members of the World Debate Champions, and we have an excellent debater from around the world. But we want to do this professional debate. Let's say the Professor Edwards and Mr. James Ed and the Manuels, Aarons, and all other the great professionals, those who join. Like it's not actually like discussions and hard talks. We want to go through more scientific way, and definitely it will be very effective. So I want to invite all of our audience, share our session as much as possible with your government, with your academy, with your corporation. I'm sure it will be very, very interesting discussion for everyone. So I directly want to go for concluding remarks. First, Mr. James Ed, then Professor Edward, then Mr. Emmanuel, and finally Mr. Aaron. Mr. James Ed, what's your concluding remarks for today?
My concluding remarks are first and foremost to thank you, Sharif, for assembling your panel, and the topics that you picked to discuss are just fascinating to me, and I'm sure of great interest to your audience. And you're talking about things that are of primary concern for our planet and for the people that live on the planet. So just a tip of the hat to you for what you're doing. So what I want to say in my concluding remarks is that, the enthusiasm that you hear about technology, you can feel it. It's okay to feel it, and it's okay to be optimistic. And in fact, I think it's a better way to be optimistic. It's healthier for me to look at the world with optimism, but that doesn't mean I look through the world through rose-colored glasses. You look at the problems that exist, but on the heels of every problem is a solution. And I believe that humanity will find the solutions to these problems. But you cannot ignore these problems. These problems must be anticipated when they can be and addressed when they cannot be. So, there's a certain amount of avoiding difficulties, but there's going to be unintended consequences, no matter what your intention, how pure your intention is. There will be unintended consequences that you will have to clean up your mess and do it. And don't sit back and let others do it. Otherwise, you're just another brick in the wall. And what we want to do is tear down walls and build bridges. And technology is helping us to do that. This communication that we're talking about today, the satellites that are enabling communications that were only imaginable in science fiction to the people of the past. They're present, they're here, and they will keep evolving. And so what we want to do is to continue to evolve, because if you stay stuck in the present, you will drift into the past. So keep moving forward. We're like sharks in that sense. If we don't keep moving forward, we will die. So keep moving forward, be optimistic, continue to believe in yourselves that you can solve any problem that you will be confronted with, but be aware of the impact on others. Do not think of yourself only. Do not think in a selfish way. Think in a selfless way. And so think about it all in this together, because more and more it's becoming obvious that we all are, whether it's the climate, whether it's the night sky that the Greeks looking up at the night sky in the ancient past didn't see what we see. There's light pollution. You can be offended by light pollution, or you can say, okay, that's the new reality. That's the present. And so what are we going to do? Maybe I'll drive up to the mountains so that I can see a clear sky. And even if I drive up to the mountains now, maybe I'm seeing Elon Musk's satellites. Oh my goodness, maybe that's not a star I'm looking at. So no, that's the present reality. So you have to accept the change and adapt to it, because it's not the survival of the most fit, it's the survival of the ones who fit best. So adapt to your environment, and the environment is stronger than any individual. Wonderful discussion, Sharif. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Professor Edward.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just make a few, 2 or 3, I think, 3 points in the closing remarks. By the way, there's the movie that inspired me, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I actually got a program when it premiered. And I like to offer your readers books to read. Here, this is a new one. Space is open for business. The industry that can transform humanity. and this is by Robert Jacobson. So any of you who are interested in sort of a deep dive into some of these issues, you want to take a look at Robert Jacobson's new book. But a couple of sort of overall points. First of all, we always talk about what can we do, and unfortunately, we often means political power and governments. And the problem is that we can be very dangerous. We talked about in the United States and even in Asia, where the government officials have decided, well, we are going to put all of our money into fiber optics. And that might not be the best way to do it, because if you have competing fiber optics, 5G, and Elon Musk's satellites, that's a better way to determine how things go. And this is one of the things, by the way, I will agree with some of the other speakers, that there is a danger of businesses and corporations trying to monopolize a market, but they do it because they have government power. If they don't have governments backing them with tariffs and with special handouts and so forth, then they can't do it. Everyone was concerned 50 or 60 years ago that General Motors and Chrysler, the big American auto companies, would never be knocked off. They were monopolies. And guess what? They got knocked off. People were concerned 40 years ago, IBM, no one's going to ever knock off that company. Guess what? Apple and Microsoft did. So be a little bit careful about saying we want to do something, because if we are politicians, the best politicians, you might say, are the best governments are the ones that ran Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan. And what they did was they created an environment, a legal system, and a more open system where they could allow experimentation. They would come in and do, the enforcement of property rights and things where they had to. But that's why those 4 countries, became models for the world. So I think that's important. By the way, in terms of, I mentioned air traffic control, and I actually have for several decades done work in the air traffic control area in this country to make sure airplanes don't knock into each other. In fact, one of my nephews is an air traffic controller at Baltimore Washington International Airport. One of the problems has been, because the air traffic control system in this country is owned by government, it was very, very difficult to introduce new technologies, and, for example, GPS tracking and so forth, because the vested interests were there and saying, well, we like doing it the way we do it, and we're investing in technology, and we're going to make sure the government does it the old-fashioned way because of the vested interest. So just be a little bit careful about that. The final 2 things I will mention, by the way, a space elevator someday might obviate even the need for satellites, and we've talked about space elevators in the past. My final thing, if you want to read a great fiction book, a great science fiction book that expresses sort of my general feeling, read The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein. That's one of my favorite books, because it looks at what would happen with a lunar colony. And it's a very, very good book. I've written pieces, by the way. I was a founding member of the Mars Society in 1998. And I've written about Martian law and about what kind of a system you would have on Mars. And by the way, it's not going to be a system where you're governed from Earth, okay? It's going to be a system in which the folks on Mars end up governing themselves. They end up exploiting the resources on Mars for their own use. That's what happens when you settle a new area. So that's, I think, what you're going to see. And there is a literature on that. And I look forward maybe in future presentations to talk about how will we colonize other planets. Who's going to be the first Malaysian or Bangladeshi on Mars, or on the lunar colony at the South Pole at Shackleton. This is going to be exciting. I can't wait for the next one to come.
Excellent, Professor Edward. Mr. Manuel.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I wanted to add a few points as concluding remarks. I think it's also important that policymakers, they give a chance to the experts to also bring in the new ideas and the new methods that they are proposing, for example, for satellite telecommunication, and to make it easier for them also to propose their ideas easily. And also, I think there should be a collaboration between international organizations, academia, and policy experts to come up with regulations on ethics and social responsibility that could help not only on satellite regulations, but in the future it can help for lunar colonization or for Mars colonization, for example. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you, Mr. Aaron.
Yes, so first off, I'd like to close by saying I personally vote for Sharif as the Martian president for 2024. 100%. I think he does embody what a good politician would be if he were to get into politics. Absolutely. That being said, look, support this man's work and his initiative. Go back, look through the videos, and to kind of for a model look for when you're looking for emerging leaders coming out in this new world, because Sharif is far ahead of the curve and far ahead of his time, and perhaps even mine. It really is an honor to have been able to have contributed to your project, and I just absolutely cannot wait to see how this grows. So that being said, as far as satellites go, it's like any other technology. It's neither good nor bad. Colonization of other planets is neither good nor bad inherently. It is what we do in the little moments that define those things in the future as being good or bad when you're looking at them from the future as looking back in the past. So in 1,000 years, it's the actions of people watching this show right now and their children and their children's children and what they choose to do with the information they're receiving here. And I pray that they go forward into this future with a solemn heart, among all else, and a sincere resolve to do good. We've been doing bad to each other for tens of thousands of years as a species. Wouldn't it be fun if we tried something just a little bit different and actually tried to do something good every day? How is that even a revolutionary thought? So go out there, do good every day. Contribute to these projects, support Sharif's work, even if that just means going through and watching his YouTube videos and sharing them with your friends. That's just the very least you can do. It's completely free and it supports an incredible cause. Thank you again, Sharif, and thank you to all the other incredible speakers that support this show.
Thank you, Mr. Aaron. Thank you, Mr. Jamesid, Professor Edwards, and Mr. Manuel. Actually, World Talent Economy Forum, like producing more hero. We have a kingmaker like Professor Edward, Mr. Jamesid, and we have a king like Aaron, Mr. Manuels. So we are connecting both of the teams, and we will produce more futuristic leaders. And trust me, if we work together, we can change our communities. And if we have a 200 different countries, peoples, and if we work together under the I do not want to say under, if this is your organizations, this is Professor Edward organization, Mr. Jamesid organizations, Mr. Manuel's organization, Mr. Aaron's organization, this is people's organization. This is for talent economy. There are many talented around the world, especially developing nations. They need more hero like today's session. So you are our hero, and you should like produce more leader for the futures, and we will work together, and by this way we will change our world and change our community. Thank you, Professor Edward, for your beautiful contribution, Mr. Jamesid for your continuous support, Mr. Manuel, your energetic support, and Mr. Aaron, I know that how you are doing hard working for World Talent Economy Forums and with your job and everything. We want all of the energetic people under this World Talent Economy Forum umbrella. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your brilliant discussion. This is one of the great session for World Talent Economy Forum. Bye-bye and take care.